Two of Them by Hristo Karastoyanov. It was all the great holidays packed into one. John Steinbeck, The Pastures of Heaven. The two of them returned from Sofia when the city felt desolate and anxious, on the threshold of a bleak and gloomy Christmas. There was no trace of the festive buzz of the last days of December from previous years. The holiday decorations, which the town hall authorities had arranged as if by default, were glowing hopelessly in the silence of fear, and a tattered mist was blowing past the wet trees, making the street lamps look like dying suns. In front of the mostly closed shops and restaurants, gone were the trite Santa Claus dolls with saxophones and their annoying "Let it snow, let it snow," and the even more indelible jingle bells, jingle all the way." Gone was the melting over the streets smell of smoke, kebabs, wine and mugwort, popcorn, vanilla and a caramel. As for the few passers-by, they were scurrying like hunched shadows of their own selves. Such were those times when even Facebook clowns had become tired of cracking pungent jokes, and as if all people had acquiesced in the new word lockdown, which, as heavy as a fist, had forever replaced the plain quarantine. They left Sofia in a van owned by some friends of hers. Marty, the instructor at the foundation school, was a little worried because she didn't know how Rocca would endure this trip. None of the assistance dogs had ever travelled beyond the city limits. That's what she told her. "Please be sure to call me if anything, by all means," Marty said. In her turn, she reassured her, paid the symbolic amount of 1 iron lev, and meanwhile Rocca jumped casually into the van, curled up into a ball at her feet, and immediately fell to sleep. Rocca slept through the whole journey, 4 hours full of happiness and a premonition of good things to come, and woke up as a tiny black clock the moment the van stopped in front of their gate. And even before her friends had managed to take her down in her wheelchair onto the pavement, and before she could roll up the cement ramp, Rocca had already inspected the house, was opening and closing the doors with brand new strips of cloth hanging from their handles, was looking carefully and sniffing at everything. Presumably, Rocca was pleased with what she saw, because when she too entered the living room, Rocca came to her, licked her cheek, and sat quietly by the wheelchair. The house was full. Indeed, a crowd of people had come to welcome them, her and Rocca. "Look, Rocca," she said to the Labrador, pretending to be serious, while the spirit of the non-stop joker twinkled in her eyes. "This is your welcoming committee. All these people, as you look at them, are my people." Indeed, she had a lot of friends. She met people on Facebook and invited them immediately home to visit. Her mother often sighed and noted almost seriously that one day they might get robbed, but she just laughed and wheeled in circles around her. She had named the house Mum's Inn, and her mother pouted, yet felt content to see all these people around. The situation was indeed like that. She had heard about the foundation for the first time 2 years before on one of the countless TV channels. They talked about a foundation with a school where guide dogs for the blind and assistance dogs for people with all sorts of sorrowful and painful conditions were raised and trained. Goosebumps broke out all over her body. She rolled the wheelchair towards the computer, found the foundation's website, and then could not sleep all night because of joy and anticipation. First thing in the morning she dialed the chair's direct number, and the chairwoman, having found out where she was calling from, nervously explained that for the time being they avoided sending assistance dogs outside of Sofia, and not only did they avoid it, they didn't send any because... She wouldn't let her finish her sentence. "I'm coming," she said. "Let's see what happens on the spot." The woman at the other end of the line replied that it was not worth going all the way, that it was merely impossible, but she cut her off. "I'm on my way." Then she impatiently called up her friends with the van and arrived at the foundation early in the afternoon. They welcomed her and started explaining to her what the problem was, what the main problems were. She was listening to them, though she looked like everything they said went in one ear and out of the other. So eventually, Albena, the chairwoman of the foundation, gave up and explained, "Okay, but why do you insist so much?" At first she thought that then it was the time to tell them everything about herself, and to start from far back in time, in fact from the very beginning, to tell them that she had only finished year 8 at school, and that as a retard. Not that she was retarded, just the opposite. However, the boarding school at Karlovo, where she attended, and where the staff were specially qualified for working with intellectually disabled children, was a middle school. Furthermore, the secondary schools in her town lacked indeed the basic facilities for people with a disease like hers. In those days, no one had even thought of ramps and elevators, unlike now. In the year of 89, when the changes took place, she was 14. Her whole life was in front of her, so she thought that would also change, waiting for it with the eagerness of a curious and inquisitive child. It did change, of course, yet not immediately, but very, very slowly. She was going to tell them how much she loved reading and that she could graduate as a private student, but that now, when she was 40-something, it was simply pointless to do so. She thought of telling them what she and her mother had been through in a town where even sidewalks with wheelchair access were still scarce. And then she was going to tell them how much she loved dogs, and even admit how furious she felt when a tasteless joke went around town that since a municipal shelter for stray dogs had been found, a Vietnamese restaurant was soon to open. She could tell them everything about her crippled life, and just as she was about to begin, she suddenly thought to herself, "Ah well, haven't you learned not to cry yet? If you feel like crying that much, do it on your own when no one is watching." As she thought, so she spoke out. "Why do I insist?" she says. "It's quite simple. I love to love, but there's no one to love." They looked at each other, then asked her to go out in the corridor and wait there. Eventually, they called her back and told her that their answer was yes. They piled around her, started asking questions. Phones were ringing and singing all over the place. People were coming in and out. Friends or mere acquaintances, next-door neighbours. They reached out to pat Rocker, but quickly remembered that they should not do so. All they did was gasp as she proudly uttered some commands, and Rocker carried them out promptly and perfectly. The dog would transform into an agile little black devil with human eyes, would go precisely to the locker she had pointed at, pull confidently at the black velvet noose, and bring to her the very thing that she had asked for. Rocker would then carefully take the well-deserved dog cookie from her hand and sit down by the wheelchair. "What other tricks could it do?" someone asked her admiringly. "How about dancing on 2 legs, riding a bike or something like that?" Now, she cut them off. "Tricks? Tricks are for the circus dog, and this dog here is working. Circus dogs are trained to entertain people, and this dog here has been trained to help them. If someone affronts me, I don't get angry, but if they abuse my dog, the best Christmas present I've ever had is my Rocker." People around her kept on inquiring where she could go with Rocker. After all, it was an animal, and she explained that Rocker had a passport on which all the Labrador's rights were listed. "I can even fly on a plane with her," she said. "Planes, bus, train. Rocker will have the place reserved next to mine everywhere, generally speaking," she said. She is not allowed only in restaurant kitchens, medical labs and surgeries, and that's just because there is no work for her there. Any other place is okay, and we can even go to the theatre together. Seriously, they all wondered, is that really true? And she laughed again and added, "And as brave and quiet Rocker and I are, we would easily move around the neighbourhood and rob houses." "As if you would," her mother said harshly, "or you'd rather go picking mushrooms." "Ah, yes, mushrooms," she noted casually. "Who gives a damn about any mushrooms? Rocker and I will start harvesting truffles, and we will become millionaires." That mushroom case, however, was not a joke at all. One night during the second week at school, she and Rocker had gone out for a walk in the park. They had reached beyond all the facilities, and then Rocker had stopped by a tree and begun sniffing at something in the grass, still damp from the day's December rain. She thought that this was probably something regular, and that the Labrador was looking for some of its natural stuff, vitamins or whatever. The girls at the school had warned her that Rocker was a bit greedy, prone to gaining weight, something that had to be avoided at any cost. In a word, she had to be careful and restricted. That evening, however, she had grown somewhat soft and decided to secretly pamper it and let it find whatever it was looking for. What happened next, though, was scary. When they returned, all of a sudden, Rocker collapsed in front of her, and she was horrified to see the real human tears flowing down from the dog's pleading eyes. She thought she was going to panic, but she pulled herself together in a flash. She called Marty, told her what was going on with Rocker, and in a few desperately long minutes, Marty landed with the doctor. She told him how they'd gone out for a walk, how Rocker had buried itself in the grass, and how that is what happened in the end. And the more she spoke, the more she despaired. "Calm down, both of you," the doctor said, grabbed Rocker and took it away somewhere. Then some more nightmarish minutes followed, filled with that chaos of fear, guilt, and hope, and when the doctor finally returned, accompanied by Rocker, who had livened up a bit, he explained to her that the dog had apparently found some mushrooms. She didn't quite understand what those damn mushrooms were. He also told her that he had urgently poured something down its throat, something she immediately forgot about, and that Rocker threw up some disgusting dark blue ball. That was all. The good news is, he laughed in the end, that now the young lady can eat whatever mushrooms she wants. She's been immunized for life, the man said, and she didn't know if he was joking. She didn't get the joke, but she suddenly realized something really important. She realized that just as Rocker would take care of her, she would too have the obligation, grief, and happiness to take care of Rocker. "Hey, girlfriend," she said softly when the doctor had left. "I will no longer have time to die because I will have to be extra careful about you, because you are my everything." Rocker looked at her somewhat sheepishly, then stood up and licked her cheek, whereafter it curled up next to the wheelchair and crashed out. They kept asking her all kinds of things. For example, they asked her about the name Why Rocker, and she explained to them at the school each dog was given a name starting with the letter with which all names in the same year began. The mother's name was Tara, hence Rocker was Rocker. Something like T-Series. She also explained that they should not be given human names, since dogs could get confused if someone called a familiar name on the street. Yet she found it difficult to keep a straight face and started cracking jokes again. "Ask me," she said, "why Labradors are the best suited for this job." "Well, there you go, tell us," the other said. "Why a Labrador and not a Caracoyan shepherd dog, for example?" "Because Labradors are the only ones who can smile," she replied triumphantly. "Nice, eh?" she exclaimed, while people around her wondered if she was joking again, or if that was indeed the case. They asked her to stop joking and rather tell them about Sofia and what it was like there for people with her condition, to which she replied that there was a huge difference between Sofia and their town. There, she said, they're wondering what they can do to help. Honestly, for example, if the road is under repair or something, someone will always stop, ask you where you are going, and show you an alternative route. I had to go through an underpass one day, and 3 heroes rushed promptly to put my limousine on the rails. And then, with one of them behind and the other 2 in front of me, we went all the way down. The same thing happened at the exit on the other side. Things like that just do not happen here. I've no idea why. In Sofia, I feel like a princess. While here, I sometimes feel like a tedious addition to the scenery." She suddenly paused, slightly spread her arms and smiled. "I'm not being completely fair, of course," she said. "You are all here for me, aren't you?" That's how it was. The short December afternoon had suddenly turned into a December night. The tides of friends had lowered, and the house had gradually gone quiet. And while her mother was preparing her for the night, Rocker casually jumped in bed next to her, curled up at her feet, and immediately fell asleep. And then she somehow knew that Rocker had picked this spot for good, which meant that she had accepted the house for her home. "The situation is like this," she had told the last of her guests. "As of now, we are two girls under the same roof. We'll be whispering to each other. We'll be telling each other girly secrets. We'll be gossiping about men, and we'll be hiding our diaries, just like in the movies." She was smiling in the dark, warm room as the shadow of the last surviving tree on their street swayed in the December wind outside her window, and it seemed to her that she would not be able to sleep a wink after everything that had happened during that endless first day, that she would stay awake all night. But then eventually she sighed and happily fell asleep, almost at the same time as Rocker. A bright, somewhat non-December sun was shining outside the next morning. The house had long since woken up. The first impatient neighbour had already come to ask her mother if there was anything she needed help with, and the sounds of plates rattling and the milk pot whistling were coming from the kitchen. She, however, was so eager that when her mother entered the room, she told her outright that she was not having breakfast that day. "Rocker and I are going out on a standing ovation tour," she said. As usual, her mother didn't even try to dissuade her. She whined for a while that it was chilly outside, that the sunshine was cold, and that the last thing she needed was to have her back with a cold. Yet she quickly prepared her for going out while Rocker was zooming around. They put the dog in an orange vest with a sign, "Assistent" and "Assistant." Then she gave the command, "Rocker, get to work," and Rocker headed for the door in an orderly manner. It was indeed frosty outside, and the sun shining in the windows was rather biting her cheeks than giving out warmth. But when they crossed the river, she was surprised to see that the upper end of the main street was full of people. Cafes were closed, but the brand new loudspeakers which the town hall authorities had fixed on either side of the promenade were spilling evergreen Christmas carols. And then it happened. As soon as they stepped on the pavement, she noticed people turning towards both of them. She was surprised, as if these were not the same people who used to ignore her and for whom she simply did not exist. Rocker was walking calmly beside her, and people around them stopped and blurted out words of kindness and amazement, and smiled. She realized all of a sudden she had already been noticed. It was as if Rocker, like a tiny black magnet, had attracted the eyes of all passers-by and had made her visible. Thus, all these strangers had accepted her. And so she lifted her head, and the two of them, Rocker and herself, set off confidently in the direction where the silver December sun was shining straight into her eyes.
This text was created with the financial support of the European Union and is part of the short story collection The Voices of Our Silence.